Recently there's been some absolutely fantastic dialogue between Seki Sensei channel, Let's Ask Seki Sensei, and some various reconstructed martial arts like HEMA, for example, which is what I do. And this has raised the fantastic question of what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of traditional living lineage martial arts versus reconstructed martial arts. Is one better than the other? Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. So very quickly, I am a HEMA instructor of 20 plus years, but I have also done traditional Asian martial arts as well to some extent, not an awful lot, but a little bit of Chinese, a little bit of Japanese, and I've interacted over the years also with Filipino and Indian martial arts and various others as well. Now, recently there was an absolutely fantastic exchange with Let's Ask Seki Sensei channel, and I did a response video to that. Also, Scalagram did a great response as well, check that out as well. Now, under the comments under there were lots of interesting questions that came up, and I think some of those will be addressed in future videos. But one of those, which actually comes up quite often, is a lot of people saying how much better living lineage martial arts are, where there's a continuous living tradition, versus reconstructed martial arts, where we have to refer to books. Now, I think there's some misconceptions in this topic, so we're going to unpack that here. But before I do, I also want to say that this is absolutely given from a position of respect. I love living lineage martial arts, and I am so happy that they still exist. But equally, I love reconstructed martial arts from historical sources, and I think there's some misconceptions about how they work, and actually the two are a lot more similar than you might think. So before we deep dive into these topics, and they're pretty complex, I'm going to have a quick word about our fantastic sponsors for this video, who are Raid Shadow Legends. Raid is the hugely popular fantasy turn-based combat game that you can play on your mobile phone or PC. The nights are drawing in, the weather's horrible outside. What better thing to do than settle down with a really cool mobile game? Raid has got hundreds of champions, it's got arenas, it's got dungeons to fight in, loads of different ways to play, as well as the new mythical champions to try out. Raid Shadow Legends is absolutely free to play, free to download. So I've got a bunch of shards to open here to get some new champions, and one of the great things about getting champions is they might be really awesome, or they might be useful to sacrifice to make your other champions stronger. Let's open a Void Shard. The Harvester's awesome, pretty rare, Dark Elves, uses an awesome scythe-like thing, hence the name Harvester. Nice! I've never had this one before. So this is Ragemonger from the Barbarians. I really like the Barbarians, I like their gear, I like the fact that they're quite simple. They're quite attacking, simple folks. So good in attack, really interesting character, I'm looking forward to using him. Let's open an orange Sacred Shard. Oh, that's badass! So Excruciator from the Demon Spawn, epic level, attack. She looks absolutely incredible. I've never even used her before, but she looks awesome, and she is epic level, so she should be epic to use. So Raid Shadow Legends has loads of amazing champions, and this latest one is truly awesome. Armed with her trademark sword, whip, and chakra, iconic 90s warrior, Xena Warrior Princess is joining Raid. She's got incredible skills that show off her fighting ability, letting her ignore her enemy's defenses and deal massive damage depending on how many buffs they've got. You can recruit this legendary warrior to your collection through the brand new Champion Pass feature. Just like the Forge Pass, there's a basic version and an elite version, with a guaranteed Xena Warrior Princess being the final reward of the Elite Champion Pass. You can also summon Xena Warrior Princess from ancient or sacred shards using special summon boosts every week between November the 10th and January the 19th, 2024. So what are you waiting for? Go check out Xena Warrior Princess in game right now, and special thanks to Universal Studios licensing. With all this exciting stuff and more coming soon to Raid, if you haven't started playing yet, then what are you waiting for? Click in my link down in the description box or scan the QR code on screen to get insane bonuses, available only via my link. We're talking epic champion Drake and other useful things like energy refills, skill tomes and XP boosters. Once you're in game and crushing your enemies, you can find me under the name Captain Context, and if you're quick enough, you can even join my clan. So just hit that link down in the description below or scan the QR code, and I'll see you on the battlefield. So thanks for sticking with me. Now let's get back to the main content of this video. So essentially, living lineage martial arts, for example Kenjutsu, but this would apply to other ones as well, through to reconstructed martial arts, whatever that means, and I think we need to unpack that term. For example, HEMA, or Historical European Martial Arts, which is obviously primarily what I'm known as, but I'm also very keen on traditional living lineage martial arts as well. So let's get into this. So first up, let's look at the advantages of traditions where there's a continuous living lineage. And Let's Ask Seki Sensei is an example of that. Clearly, if we go to Japan, there are continuous living lineages going back hundreds of years of Kenjutsu, Iaido. Obviously, Kendo is more modern, but if you look at things like Jiu-Jitsu, and various forms of Budo, essentially. Now, I should mention, I am in no way an expert at those. So just like Shogo says, I am, I suppose, to some degree, a HEMA expert, but I am not at all a Japanese martial arts expert or a Chinese or a Filipino or Korean martial arts expert. I'm not an Asian martial arts expert. However, I suppose compared to some Western people, I know a fair amount about Japanese swords because I'm an antique dealer. This is an original Muromachi period katana, which I imported from Japan. So I do handle original Japanese weapons. I also look at replicas of them, which for the most part aren't very close to the originals at all. But I do wonderfully get to handle a lot of originals, and therefore I've also taken a fairly active interest in traditional Japanese martial arts. And I have some friends who are very active in teaching Japanese martial arts in the UK and further afield, in fact, in the USA and Europe as well. So I've had some exposure to it. But moreover, I have also had a lot of interaction with traditional living lineage martial arts over the years. Some European, we'll come back to that later in the video, but also, for example, Indian or Chinese or Filipino. So this doesn't only apply to Japanese martial arts, but obviously the inspiration for this is the Kenjutsu and Iaido things that we've seen on Let's Ask Seki Sensei. So the first obvious advantage of a living lineage is it's already existing. There's no reconstruction, there's no instructions or packing required. It purely is there and it's ready to go. So you're ready to jump into that as a student, learn from usually someone who's been studying for a very long time, who studied under someone else, who studied under someone else, who studied under someone else. So the great thing about it is you can jump straight in and learn straight from that tradition. And connected to that, it means that there is an existing culture around that martial art. There is existing training weapons, training clothes, even what the dojo or classroom looks like, the etiquette, the ranking systems. So there's an existing infrastructure, if we call it that. There's an infrastructure, everything down to the type of shoes you wear or don't wear if you're barefooted, all the way up to ranking, grading, perhaps competitions if that's an element to it, the environment you train in, absolutely, the vocabulary, what we name all the parts of the weapon, exactly, the way of teaching as well is very often passed down. So not just what's taught, but the way of teaching. So there is a massively complex, usually, existing infrastructure, and you don't have to invent any of this from scratch. You don't have to fill in gaps because it's all there ready to go. Now, another advantage of existing living lineages, I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of, is that they're often legally recognized, protected, sometimes at government level, and therefore also often funded as well. So if you are practicing something that is regarded as of heritage, historical, cultural, perhaps even religious significance in a certain place, it's entirely possible that the laws of that place will protect you. They'll give you, the laws about what weapons you can own and transport and this kind of stuff. And additionally, they may well even fund you. You might even get government funding. You might even find that it's taught in schools, and that if you're a teacher of that thing, you literally might be paid by the government to teach it in schools. This, I believe, happens in China, for example, with traditional Chinese martial arts. So again, it's part of this greater infrastructure. One of the massive advantages of a living lineage is that it's already embedded in the culture, the laws, and the government. Now, the final big advantage, and I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list, but I think the final big advantage of a living lineage is that there are subtle details which are passed down from master to student, who then becomes a master, and down to a student who then becomes a master. There are subtle details that are passed down that sometimes would get overlooked or missed in a tradition where we were only passing down manuscripts, treatises, manuals, books, in other words. So, in other words, there are little subtle details about how you might move the sword or hold the sword or step or twist your body or balance where you place these things. These kind of tiny little minute details. And we see this in Let's Ask Seki Sensei. It's one of the reasons I absolutely love that channel, is because you see these tiny little subtle details in a living lineage, which unfortunately in some branches of HEMA, which are reconstructed from hundreds of years old books, sometimes we just don't have that level of subtlety. And I'm really jealous and envious of the fact that they have that in living lineages. So now let's look at some of the advantages of reconstructed martial arts. Now, when a lot of people think about HEMA, I think they think about long swords, they think about medieval weapons. But one thing before we dive into this to remember is that actually HEMA is a very, very broad term. We have a vast array of weapons, periods, systems. So as well as longsword, and even within longswords, so you could be studying Fury Delivery, which is fairly different, although it has a lot of crossover, with Lichtenau or later Meyer, Paulus Hector Meyer, various other traditions of longsword. They could be different styles. So just the same as in, for example, Japanese martial arts, we have different ryu of schools and essentially of Kenjutsu. They will have differences between them. Okay, so Katori Shinto ryu is not the same as something else, for example, what Seki Sensei practices. So they've got different styles, and we get the same thing in longsword. So that's the first thing to say, is there are different traditions. But HEMA's way, way bigger than just longsword, okay? It might be this, it might be a cup hilt rapier, Spanish cup hilt from the 17th century. Completely different system, completely different period. But equally, it might be daggers, it could be one-handed swords, sword and buckler, side sword and buckler, it could be sword and dagger. Obviously longsword, langmesser, dusak, it could be pole weapons, which obviously you also have in Japanese martial arts. Various forms of spear and glaive and halberd and poleaxe. It could be in armour or out of armour, and we'll come back to that in a second as well. And indeed, not just weapons. I think this often gets overlooked, is that certain styles of boxing and wrestling are also HEMA. And if you go back to the age, if we go back to the age of this rapier, for example, in fact, let's pick up an original. So again, I'm an antique dealer, so I've got originals. Here's an original Spanish 17th century rapier. If we go back to the period of this sword, we actually have unarmed martial arts from this same period as well, okay? Just the same as you do in Japan. So while one person might be studying jiu-jitsu and another person studying kenjutsu, and there's some crossover and they might be useful to each other, exactly the same in European martial arts as well. Okay, so don't just think about longsword, think about all the different weapons and all of the unarmed martial arts that come under the title, really, of reconstructed martial arts, because we don't necessarily always, and I'll come back to that, have a continuous living lineage. But here's the headline about reconstructed martial arts. They're not entirely reconstructed from scratch. So yes, indeed, we often look at books, treatises, manuals, whatever, books, okay? However, that's not all we draw upon. If we are studying, for example, the rapier or the small sword, we still have a continuous living lineage of fencing. We still have a language of fencing. Fencing is an Olympic sport and has a continuous tradition going all the way back to the Middle Ages. There is no point in European history from when it started until now, from when swords were invented, when fencing hasn't been a thing. Yeah, okay, it might have evolved, it might have changed, but fencing has got a continuous living lineage. And that's the same for unarmed martial arts as well. It's the same for wrestling, it's the same for boxing. There's many different regional styles of wrestling. There's different styles of boxing as well. So unarmed and armed martial arts do have continuous living lineages. I think where the misconception lies is people look at something like longsword and they don't, in their brain, equate it with fencing. They think of it as something which died out and then was reinvented in the late 20th century. And that's not really true, because we do have continuous living lineages of European martial arts, and some of those have different connecting tissue and connecting points with the longsword and with all of the things that came between now and the longsword. So in my mind, a major advantage of, let's say, reconstructed from books martial arts is those books, those treatises, those manuals, which do exist in places like Japan as well, and China, and we'll come back to that in a second. They give you a snapshot in time. So actually, European martial arts do have continuous living lineages, but we have these almost photographic snapshots in time, for example, of 15th century longsword. So rather than a modern Olympic fencer saying, okay, well, let's reconstruct a longsword And you know, my background's in epee, and I've done some wrestling at college, so I've done wrestling and I've done some epee. Let's reconstruct longsword fighting. You could construct a martial art for the use of the longsword, absolutely. Would that be HEMA? Well, we've talked about this in previous videos, but the fact is we don't need to, because we have treatises. We've got the treatises, the manuals, these fantastic texts, many of which have pictures and are illustrated, telling us how they used longswords in the 15th and 16th centuries. So we don't need to make it up. We can literally go, okay, we understand how fencing works, we understand tempo, we understand the body mechanics. Also, we've got things like wrestling, we've got other martial arts we can draw upon just within the European, and that's without even referring to out of Europe martial arts, which we can do if we want to cross-reference with what's being done in Japan or Korea or wherever. We can do that if we want to, but just looking within Europe, we can draw upon the living lineages and our understandings of combat, and then we can look, and this is what we do in HEMA, then we look at the treatises and we can go, okay, so they say that when you have a bind here, someone's cut at you here, the instruction manual, essentially the treatise says, first of all, you form your cross, whether it's a Fiore Incrociata or whether it's a Zornhau, depends which tradition you're doing, but let's do a Fiore Incrociata. And then you've locked them to the outside and gained the centre line, and from there you thrust them in the face. But if you go to thrust them in the face and they push off to the side in posta frontale, then you perform a volta and cut to the other side. So we start to get these very simple technique instructions in the treatises, and we can say categorically, with no doubt, that's what they did in the 15th century. So we don't have to make it up. So even though we don't necessarily have a continuous living lineage of longsword, we do have continuous living lineages of other European martial arts to draw upon basics and fundamentals of, and we can see categorically from the book how they used one of these swords in the 15th century, and we can copy the steps, practice them, and learn from them. Now, one of the advantages of that, which I've always thought living lineages which don't have books might suffer from, in theory, and I'll come back to that point, is that we don't have mission creep. Okay, so if you imagine you have teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student for generations and generations. After 10 generations, do you think the techniques that the master is teaching now are the same as what the master was teaching 10 generations before? They might be, they can be, but they might have diverged. So if your interest is to know exactly how a katana was used in the Muromachi period, for example, or Kamakura, whatever, you don't know certainly that your school of Kenjutsu is doing it the same way now as they were in the 14th or 15th century. However, they might be. So this is the point that I said I'd come back to a couple of times. As it happens, a lot of Kenjutsu schools do actually have scrolls. So this is the funny thing. A lot of people think living lineage over here, reconstructed martial art over here. Actually, they're not that different. The point is that the reconstructed martial art also has living lineages feeding into it. The living lineage martial art very often also has books and treatises or scrolls feeding into it. So a lot of traditional Korean, Chinese and Japanese and other martial arts in the world do have written texts to draw upon, and you can look back and you can say, okay, so this is the way we do this technique now with the katana or tachi or whatever you're using, and it's a little bit different in this. We do this, and 7 generations ago they said to do this instead, and sometimes it's just a difference of a master. This master preferred this way, this master preferred another way, or it might be exactly the same because it's been passed down so faithfully. So the fact is that yes, it's an advantage with reconstructed martial arts that we have books to draw upon from hundreds of years ago, and that's fantastic and amazing, and I've always found it magical, and that's why I love HEMA. But it's not that they're necessarily lacking that in living lineage martial arts either. Sometimes they also have that, and sometimes the living lineage is so faithful and conservative in the information it passes down that it stays true to form anyway. And just with that thought in mind for a second, I think it's worth mentioning as well that particularly in a country like Japan, the weapons, while they did change, a late Edo period katana doesn't look the same as a Kamakura tachi or a Muromachi katana. They have differences, but they're not hugely different. They don't massively change as weapons. Whereas, but carefully put that down, whereas in Europe, clearly in the 17th century, a weapon like this is very different to a 15th century like this. So there was more change in weapons, and obviously change in weapons and armour and these kinds of things has a knock-on effect on the martial arts. So in a place where the weapons and the armour change proportionately less, there's probably proportionately less change in the martial arts. So to finish up with a couple more advantages of reconstructed martial arts, I think one area where living traditions which don't have books sometimes miss out is they don't necessarily have advice for situations or equipment which are no longer in use. So clearly in Japan, for example, it's clear to see at the in the Kenjutsu schools, for example, there are very, very few that do armoured fighting, but they used to. They stopped doing it because gradually over time nobody wanted to learn the armoured fighting. So there are, as I say, there are certain Kenjutsu Ryu where you can go and learn the armoured techniques, and indeed they have essentially half-swording techniques and other things that we would find in European sources. They also talk about where to aim with thrusts or cuts at certain parts, gaps in the armour, this kind of stuff. So there is specific advice in Japanese martial arts for how to overcome certain aspects of armour. However, that's quite hard to find in Japanese martial arts. If we go to medieval European treatises, there's absolutely loads of stuff, because clearly in medieval Europe, lots of people were wearing armour and fighting armour in armour, as they were in Japan. It's just that we have those books, those pictures, those treatises, manuals to draw upon to be able to see exactly how they did it and the details of the technique. So that's yet again a strength of having that written and pictorial source material to work from. It's really about the record preserving something, a snapshot in time that would have been forgotten in a continually evolving and being handed down lineage. Now the final point is slightly controversial, and I've seen people online argue as this is a point why HEMA is better than a given other martial art. And that is because something that we consider really, really important in HEMA is pressure testing. That is sparring, fighting, competing. And not all martial arts do that. And, you know, not all, I think, even in Europe, in period, not all of them did that. And I think we've got a very kind of modern fencing outlook on this. We wear modern fencing masks, we wear modern gear, and you could say that's an advantage of reconstructed martial arts, because we have the disconnection from some of the traditions of living lineages. It frees us up to use modern training equipment, modern types of synthetic sword, like in fact the one that Seki Sensei was using, the synthetic sword from the night shop. Or, you know, fencing masks, which aren't at all anything they're not, fencing masks are completely unrelated to the use of longswords historically, but they're pretty much always used with reconstructed longsword fighting now, for obvious safety reasons, and so that we can bash each other in the head. What did they do in period? They probably did it exactly like Seki Sensei. They did lots and lots of drilling, and they didn't hit each other in the head. They hit, but then they didn't actually hit. And even when they did hit, they were using feather swords, flat ones, and they were hitting with the flat, and they probably were only actually hitting each other within certain competitions, and during practice they might not have been doing that at all. So the context is obviously very different in the modern world. We've got lots of protective equipment, we can use modern equipment, but therefore it does enable us to spar and to fight. And some people would list this as an advantage of reconstructed martial arts, because we've got this disconnect from the traditional way of doing things. We can do it in whatever way suits the modern world. If we want to fight with lightsabers with fencing masks on, if we want to fight with plastic swords, if we want to fight with rattan sticks, even though it's not part of our culture, and rattan doesn't come from Europe, we can do it, and no one's going to tell us not to. So in a sense, reconstructed martial arts are a little bit more liberal in that sense, a little bit more free to do what they want in the way that they want, and therefore we do often pressure test things hard in quite a tough, sporting, competitive way. But it's important to point out that not all living lineage martial arts don't do that. Some of them absolutely definitely do. And a classic example are Filipino martial arts, where there are old schools of Kali and Eskrima and Arnis, but they do compete with modern head protection and modern gloves, lacrosse gloves and things like this, and they do absolutely batter the hell out of each other with sticks. So actually they're doing something a little bit similar to what HEMA does, even though they are a living lineage. So simply being a living lineage, a continuous lineage of martial arts, doesn't mean that you can't also adopt modern ways of doing things. And I know that in Japan today, there is also a movement of doing that. There are people doing something equivalent to HEMA, but with Japanese equipment and Japanese weapons as well. So even traditional martial arts can do that. So to conclude, the headlines here are that living lineage martial arts and things like HEMA, reconstructed martial arts, are not necessarily at all as different as you might think. In fact, they're actually very, very similar in many, many ways, and they end up at a similar result. Even if they come by different routes, they can end up as a similar result. But remember that living lineage and reconstructed are not always separate. Sometimes even within a living lineage, there can be a degree of reconstruction because certain aspects have been lost. I know people practicing certain Chinese martial arts where they've had to reconstruct bits because some of the teaching structure has been lost being passed down the line, and so they've kind of filled in the gaps. So that has happened within living lineages, and equally within reconstructed things like HEMA, we do draw on living lineages as well. We draw on the continuous tradition of fencing or wrestling and boxing, but also we look at Asian or other martial arts as well. And on that note, what's happening here is also demonstration of that sometimes something like HEMA has a conversation with something like Kenjutsu or Iaido or traditional Japanese martial arts, and therefore they are interacting. There are thoughts passing between the two, and sometimes it might make you look at how you're practicing a certain technique in a certain way. And hold on, maybe if I took a leaf out of their book, maybe that would give me a new way of looking at what I'm doing. So anytime there's interaction, and there always has been between reconstructed and living lineages, anytime there's interaction, there's also cross-pollination. And something that I think often gets missed is that while 20, 30 years ago, we were at the infancy of reconstructing things like the use of the longsword, remember that was 20 or 30 years ago. Are we now in a living lineage? I would argue yes. I have now people teaching in my club who I have been teaching for the last 10 years, and now they're teaching other people, and those people will go on to teach other people. It's happening. We are now part of a living lineage. We're already in it. It doesn't even take generations. It just takes years, a few years, not that many years. Remember that historically generations were shorter than they are now. Shorter life expectancy, and people passed on information. I think they had to pass on information within fairly small frames of time sometimes. So a reconstructed martial art that was reconstructed 50 years ago, 30 years ago, by this point is starting to become its own living lineage that is the result of all of the interactions that have gone before. In the end, I really want you to go away from this video with the realization that, and if you'd watched my previous video as well, that it doesn't matter whether someone is part of a living lineage in Japan or a relatively recently reconstructed lineage in Europe, based on completely different histories and culture. We can learn from each other, and we are interacting. And actually often when two weapons or scenarios or contexts are similar, we often come up with relatively similar results. As we saw from Let's Ask Seki Sensei's video and my response to it and Scalagrim's response to it, the fact is there are a lot of techniques which are extremely similar between a traditional living lineage of Kenjutsu or Iaido, and I know he does Kendo as well, and what we see with reconstructed European martial arts using something like a longsword. There are a lot of parallels. Yes, there's differences, but there's even differences between different longsword schools and between different katana schools. The fact is there's a lot of crossover and a lot of similarity. So even if people come at it from a different direction, in different places, at different times, they often end up with quite similar results. I hope this has been fun and interesting to watch. I'm fascinated to see your comments and thoughts down below in the comments section. Please remember to like and share, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really, really soon. And once again, I want to thank the sponsors for this video, who've been Raid Shadow Legends. The sponsors obviously make running a channel like this possible, so thanks once again to them, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.